Hi, this video is part one of the learning unit. The learning unit is the fourth unit in AP Psychology, and this video will just cover classical conditioning. The next two videos will cover operant conditioning and social learning. So let's start with a definition of learning. Most students think of learning as acquiring knowledge, acquiring information, holding that in your memory, and that's definitely an aspect of learning, but this particular unit is focused on a different type of learning. This type of learning we're going to focus on is acquiring behaviors, and this aspect of why did they learn to act or perform that response, or why did that behavior occur. That's the type of learning that we're referring to, acquiring behaviors. And so behaviorism is a realm of psychology that is focused on observable actions and behaviors that you can see and record. There are three types of learning on the screen, and as I said, in this particular video, we will focus on classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is a little bit abstract. Anytime you hear conditioning, conditioning is a type of learning where you learn to pair two things together. And so if you think about conditioning, and it is just a word that's hard to associate things with, if you just think of conditioning as learning and you just replace conditioning with learning, you'll be okay. So classical conditioning is it's really interesting. Classical conditioning is where a person or an animal learns to have a reflexive response or an involuntary response, a behavior that you don't have conscious control over, to a neutral stimulus. So this is kind of strange. So this would be similar to, let's define neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that doesn't naturally make you have any kind of reaction. So looking at this paper is probably a neutral stimulus because you probably didn't do anything. You had no reaction to that paper. You didn't flinch or your pupils didn't dilate. You probably had no reaction to it. It was neutral. Now, there are different stimuli that do cause you to have reflexive responses. For example, heat causes you to sweat. A bright light in your eye causes your pupil to constrict. Those are stimuli that do cause reflexive responses. But classical conditioning is where you learn that you learn to have, whenever you're presented with a neutral stimulus, you respond with an involuntary response. So it's kind of bizarre, but when we learn about it, you'll probably be able to kind of piece this together and see how it works. So let's define the two words on the screen. The first word is a stimulus. Anytime you see the word stimulus, remind yourself that a stimulus is an object. Anytime you see or hear the word response, remember a response is a behavior. So let's start with how classical conditioning was discovered. Classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist. He actually had a medical degree, and he was researching digestion. And his studies of digestion lasted 2 decades, and he actually stumbled upon the psychological concept called classical conditioning through his studies on digestion. He was collecting saliva, dogs' saliva in test tubes that were attached to their glands, and as they were collecting saliva, he was recording that information. He was noticing that dogs started to salivate, which is an involuntary response. You cannot make yourself or will yourself to salivate. They were salivating to things and stimuli that was not just the food in their mouth. So he noticed that before the dogs would even get food in their mouth, their test tubes would be filling up with saliva. And so he realized that they were anticipating that the food was coming, and they were salivating. They couldn't control that. It just was happening. Their body was anticipating that the food was coming, and they were salivating. So even the sight, when they would see the food bowl, they would start to salivate. When they would hear the footsteps coming in the room, they would start to salivate, anticipating that food was coming. Even if you know food is coming, you can't just make yourself salivate by, okay, food is coming, make myself salivate. You can't do that. It is an involuntary response. And so he called these psychic secretions, because it's as if this dog understood that food was coming and its body just started salivating on the anticipation that food would enter its mouth. So let's just talk through this really quickly. Naturally, if you see on the screen, naturally the sight or even the sound of a bell should not make a dog salivate. What should make a dog salivate is food in its mouth. But what Ivan Pavlov realized was he could pair something with that food, and anytime, it could be any kind of neutral stimulus, the sound of a bell, the changing of the lights. He could make any neutral stimulus create this salivation response. All he had to do was pair that neutral stimulus just a half a second before the food, and then the dog would salivate. Enough pairings of that bell and food, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. He could ring the bell without the food, and then the dogs would start to salivate because the dogs would be anticipating that food was coming and start to have that reflexive response. So the words at the bottom of the screen are words you're going to need to define. Let's go ahead and put them on the next slide. A neutral stimulus. This is an object that should not create an involuntary response and doesn't. It's neutral, and so it is something, it's an object that you have no natural or involuntary response to. This would be like the sound of a bell. You're not going to have any kind of reflexive reaction to the sound of a bell. You shouldn't sweat to the sound of a bell or, flinch to the sound of a bell. An unconditioned stimulus is an object that does create a reflexive or natural response. So heat is an unconditioned stimulus. Heat causes a natural response. It causes you to sweat. Or someone making a loud noise right behind your ear is a natural stimulus that would naturally cause you to flinch. It would surprise you. That you didn't have to learn any of those reactions. An unconditioned response is the behavior that is unlearned. You didn't have to learn this behavior. You just naturally have this behavior, this reflex, naturally. So an unconditioned response would be sweating when it's hot. You didn't have to learn to sweat when it's hot. Your body naturally sweats when it's hot. That's a natural response, a natural reflexive response. A conditioned stimulus is a stimulus that you've been conditioned to. You have learned to have an involuntary response to this object that you didn't naturally have a response to. So this is starting as your neutral stimulus. For example, the bell. The bell was once neutral, but when it was paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, enough, bell, food, bell, food, bell, food, it eventually becomes a conditioned stimulus, a stimulus that you do have, that you've learned to have a reflexive response to. The conditioned response is the reflexive response that you are now having to that once neutral object, the conditioned stimulus. So salivating to the bell became the conditioned response. The word that's not up here that you do need to know is acquisition. Acquisition is the point at which the conditioned response is acquired, the point at which the dog started salivating to the bell. So one more part of this is taking it one step further. Once Ivan Pavlov could get the dog to salivate or have this conditioned response to a sound, like a metronome, salivating to a metronome, he realized he could take it one step further. So when he got that dog to salivate to a sound, he could then present the sound to the dog, sound to the dog, sound to the dog, and the dog would salivate, and present it with something else. A black square, sound, salivate, black square, sound, salivate. And then the black square could get the dog to salivate and did not even have to have that food present. John Watson is the next person that you need to know in this section. John Watson actually created the field of behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov wasn't a psychologist. He stumbled upon classical conditioning. John Watson followed him and took this into a field called behaviorism in psychology. And so John Watson wanted to see if he could take this concept of classical conditioning and condition a fear response, an involuntary response to fear. And he did this with a child named Little Albert. That was his laboratory name, Little Albert. And what he did was he presented this same situation where he wanted to see if he could get this child to have a fear response, a natural fear response like crying, to an object he wasn't naturally afraid of. And this object was a white rat. So initially, Little Albert was not afraid of the white rat. He actually showed interest in the white rat. But what John Watson did was he presented the rat with a loud noise. Loud noise, rat. Loud noise, rat. Loud noise, rat. Eventually, what happened was Little Albert became afraid of the rat when he wasn't initially afraid of the rat because he was anticipating this loud noise, and John Watson concluded that you could condition fear. And he also realized several other aspects of this. So first you can see this was kind of the method of what occurred, that he realized Albert could be conditioned to fear a white rat, but he also realized that little Albert would generalize. So once he conditioned Albert to fear the white rat, he wanted to see, would Albert also be afraid of things that are similar to the white rat? So he presented, after he conditioned the fear response, he presented other things that were similar to the white rat, furry objects. And he noticed little Albert exhibited the same fear responses to things that were similar. He generalized furry objects like the bunny or a puppy. And this is called generalization. Whenever he would have the same conditioned response to similar objects to the conditioned stimulus. The next thing that he realized was not everything would be generalized. So things that weren't similar, he didn't have fear responses to. So toy trucks, he did not have the fear response. So he realized that little Albert could discriminate things that were not similar. What he then found out was if he could, if he would continuously present the white rat to Albert without the sound, eventually the conditioned response, that fear response, would go away. It was as if Albert kind of understood that they were no longer paired anymore and he was not producing that fear response or that conditioned response. This is extinction, where that conditioned response starts to go away after the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus are separated. So then, after the extinction has occurred, he only had to pair them together one more time. If extinction occurred, if he just paired that sound with the rat again, that conditioned response would come right back, and he called that spontaneous recovery. So this leads us to our last concept, and this is a person. His name is Robert Rascorla, and Robert Rascorla, he was actually a cognitive psychologist, so he focused on thought processes, and he actually believed that classical conditioning did have a component of cognition. So John Watson would say absolutely not. This was all, like, this had nothing to do with your thought processes. But Robert Rascorla said that he really did think that there was a cognitive aspect to this. Robert Rascorla believed that in order to have this occur, there was an anticipation that was a cognitive anticipation that, for example, if this rat hits a lever and associates the lever with cheese, he has this cognitive process that's occurring, and that is still a key factor in establishing the conditioning. And so he just added on that he believed there truly was a cognitive aspect, where John Watson would say absolutely not. There's no cognitive piece involved in this. So we have gone through all of classical conditioning, and this is kind of an abstract concept, and it is a lot to remember. I would say the best thing for you to do with this concept is, when you're identifying parts of a classical conditioning experiment, I would talk yourself through: a stimulus is an object, a response is a behavior. Unconditioned means that it was unlearned. I naturally had that response to that stimulus. I didn't have to learn that response to that stimulus. Or I was conditioned. I did have to learn that response to that stimulus. And I usually have to talk myself through that when I am going through an example of classical conditioning. I think that is the most helpful thing to do for classical conditioning and identifying those parts. I hope this was helpful, and next video is operant conditioning.